when the ask went out to you, to give some kind of a background to this current project, but also your practice in general. So, as we go around, please give a short kind of an introduction about yourselves, your practice right now. It can be really that moving into, the past. So it can be certainly about this project, but it could maybe be about what has informed this project also for you over the last some time. I'm understanding this, all your series is something that has come about as a result of different kinds of practices that you have been involved in. And from that, I mean, the general interest in questions of belonging and identity apart, even, the genre itself, portraiture, what that brings with it, questions of representation. These are all kind of central and vital to us in any case at PIX. Um, with respect to this particular volume, I think we were thinking about a few um, things as we went about approaching a lot of the artists and putting the open call for submissions. And I think I would be safe to say that we were thinking quite closely about what is normative in the inscription of the subcontinent today, right? So the whole question of South Asia, South Asian, South Asianism, these have moved beyond perhaps the normative. They have kind of inscribed multiple, diverse, and very densely intertwined socio-cultural commonalities across the board. And I think we were interested in looking at shared histories of the subcontinent within and outside the subcontinent, how you sort of globalize if that is necessary, the whole question of South Asianism at this point of time, and how vitally diasporic South Asian artists have collaboratively, individually thought about cross-genre, have thought about the experimental, or rather intersectional work, in time. So you all are all dealing quite distinctly in aesthetic paradigms of one sort or another. And what we found interesting, especially in trying to bring you all together today, is a kind of referencing of the archive that you all have done specifically in your work, a kind of personal narrative that has come to play. But I think one is also aware today of curatorial methodologies that have enabled the archive to take on new dimensions right now. And I know, Zinnia, for instance, you bring a lot of that into your display practice and your exhibitionary work that I was looking up earlier. Um, I think it will have particular resonance. The media itself will have particular resonance when you come to talk about your work. So please do focus on that to some extent, if you can. Um, and yes, I was thinking particularly for you, since this is not the first time you have contributed to the PIX issues, but this one is, I would say, something that has to do with questions of certainly representation, but also different iconographies into which the subcontinent has been subsumed over a period of time. It has been funneled into a period of time. And I think we're all looking at ways in which global histories will give us a new telling of aesthetic paradigms moving into the future. So, and that's something that you tackle, I think, quite head on. And I think all of this comes together quite beautifully also in your work, Rajat, which is, as you have described, something of a montage and a collage, a composite that has been
Yeah.
generated through the inscription of memory over time. I, all of these for us, are very good entanglements, you could call them that, in order to think about the present, to think about where we are placed in the world, and who and what is, once again, South Asian at this time. And all of you all have referenced this within your body of work quite distinctly. With that short proviso and introduction, maybe we can launch right in. If I may, could we begin with you, Zinnia? And you could sort of lead us into your project and share your screen and or speak to us, whichever mode you prefer.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for including me in this discussion, also in PIX, because I think as a diasporic artist who is South Asian, and especially in this project, Dear Nani, like I am often addressing directly, like colonial heritage and roots. But I'm based in Toronto. I grew up in Canada, and I have my entire practice is based here. So I'm often working from away. And so you're always kind of like wondering how your practice resonates with actually people in South Asia, and like having a, conversation with that group, just to make sure that I'm sort of tackling my projects in the right way. I also think the work maybe has resonance with people who are of diaspora in that way too. But yeah, you always want to kind of be conscious of that conversation. And I'm just so happy to be part of this publication and speaking with you all today. So thank you very much. So I am speaking to you today from Toronto, and I will maybe just say a little bit more generally, my practice does, I've been interested in working with family archives and the family album from early beginnings in my practice. So that is often a launching point for me. And I think approach it in different ways, but to address personal and also like larger political issues that just kind of come up when you're looking at vernacular family photos. So I will go into sharing my screen and speak more directly about my project, Dear Nani. So I'll start off with a little bit of how I came to this project. So the project Dear Nani is looking at photos of my Nani that were taken in 1948. As I said, I do often work with the family album in my work, but I found these images. My Khala had given me a family album which had been damaged in a flood, and she asked me to kind of repurpose or put together these images for her. And then I came across these images of my Nani, which were taken on her honeymoon, and in them she is cross-dressing. So she's wearing the clothes of her husband. So what I know about this project is from what my mom, my Ami, has told me, which is that her parents were on their honeymoon in Quetta. This is the year after partition, and my Nana, my mother's father, was a pretty sort of avid photographer. He was really interested in arts and photography, and it's very likely, or most likely, that he was the photographer in this session, and then that's his clothes that my Nani is wearing. So of course, when I came across these images, I was, they're just such beautiful artifacts, and I kind of had to figure out how do I activate these images? How do I work with them? But there were so many sort of unanswered questions and things that I didn't know because my grandparents had passed away, that I felt like I needed to give a little bit of context to my audience. But at the same time, I also wanted to keep an air of mystery and an air of privacy with the images as well. So one of the ways that I went about that was by including this. So you'll see that the images are accompanied by a fictional text. The text is fiction. I wrote it because Nani passed away when I was a teenager, so I didn't get to actually ask her about these images. And we actually didn't have a very close relationship. She used to visit me in Canada a few times, but unfortunately, I actually didn't get to know her very well when she was alive. So this project has been a way for me to also get to know her youth in a way that I would never have access to otherwise. So in the text, I'm asking her about why she took the images and, why this kind of gender play would have happened. And sometimes she's answering my questions with like very factual answers. And then other times she's just saying things like, oh, I don't remember, or it was just dress up, it was just fun. I'm not, there was no sort of big idea behind it that she had in her mind. But of course, myself as an image maker and someone who studies photography, and I'm reading a lot of colonial and gender politics into the images. But I wanted to kind of strike a balance between that and then also the kind of personal familial history. So that's something I attempt to do in this series. I insert myself in the project mostly so you might notice in some of the photos, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but In the corners of some of the photos, there's images of children. There's children in the background, or you probably saw it more clearly in the first image. There's people in the background. So what they were doing, this kind of gender play that they were doing wasn't a fully private act, although I know it did start on their honeymoon. There was people around who were witnessing what they were doing. And I kind of see myself as one of the children in the background of the photos who's trying to kind of understand what these two adults are doing and understand this gender play and wanting to be part of the performance, but ultimately outside of the performance as well. So I've included, images of myself in this way. So like in this image, for example, I'm wearing a banyan, an undershirt, which I kind of attribute as a piece of clothing that for me is both childlike, because I used to wear it when I was a kid, and also masculine in a way. So that's why I've worn it in this fashion, and I've kind of flattened my chest to make myself look more childlike in this image. And one of the artifacts that kind of leads me to think about more of the specific colonial, education that my grandparents were also receiving was these children's dictionaries, which are a set of dictionaries that were British dictionaries, but they were actually printed in India, Burma, and Ceylon, as they say in the front cover. And you can see that my nanny is also holding one in this image. So these are a set of dictionaries that were super important to my mom's family. So she actually moved these dictionaries to Canada with her when she immigrated to Canada, because they're really beautiful color illustrations and lovely stories. But when I picked up these dictionaries to start looking at them as an artifact, I noticed a lot of very problematic imagery, a lot of racist imagery, a lot of very, stereotypical imagery. So in this illustration, you have all these different, different people from all over the world who are offering up these goods for these British children in the middle. So this also kind of reminded me of the education and the kind of background that my grandparents, and particularly my nana, because although I don't see him directly in the photographs, he is the kind of director of this photo session. It's also his clothes. So I'm thinking about his education as a British gentleman, and what that kind of meant, and how one is expected to behave in a proper way. And I kind of see that as well in a lot of the stiff poses that Nani is taking on when she does this performance. So in a way, for me, she's performing the role of this like idealized, British man or a gentleman in this way. So I like to include the original images. So the original images are only 2 by 3 inches in real life, because I want to make it clear that these are found images. And then I'll include as well larger reproductions of the images, so that you can really see all of the detail in them, as well as snippets of the text that I've written. And I've also kind of pulled out different details from the backgrounds of these images and photographed them in my parents' home in Canada. So you can see here, there's the kind of clothesline in the back of this image. So I've recreated that in our family home as well. And then at the end, well, I do kind of see this series as sort of a linear trajectory, and that's often the way that I install it. And I like to kind of end off with this sort of almost like a reveal, where I usually say to my nanny, I wish I had asked you about this when you were alive. This is very different from the way that I had remembered you. And she says, I know you did, Beti, but we learned to keep these things private. So again, I kind of wanted to keep this element of privacy in the work as well. I also like to include images of both my nani and nana at the end, because as I mentioned, I did think it was a collaborative performance with the two of them. So yeah, so this is some images of how I've installed the work. There's layering, and different sort of reproductions. I often sometimes include the original dictionaries as well in installation formats. And yeah, I also wanted to just mention that I've also recently, just this past week, actually launched my own photo book for this series. So I'm really happy and proud. And I kind of want to thank the PIX team as well, because they introduced me to Arushi, who also has an element of her poem. Because it was so beautiful, I wanted to also include that in the book. So the book is printed in English and French. And also, yeah, there's Arushi's poem included as an insert. And I've also included a glossary of terms. That's my own little mini dictionary, and an essay about the project written by myself. So yeah, so that's a way to find a little more information.
Thanks for that wonderful presentation. And it's really lovely to know that there was continuity and there was something of a, a collaborativeness even in the forthcoming project. It makes me think of, and I think I'm not wrong in assuming this, Yask, that you two were thinking of your project as a publication. So it might be interesting to hear from you next is how this has come together in your project.
Sure, sure.
Not only, of course, for the PIX issue, but the larger project that you're handling.
Yeah, so I guess my project, which is on Indian hawkers, men who came from undivided India and worked as travelling salesmen in Australia in the late 1800s into the 1900s. I guess my project started in a sense with my own lack of knowledge of Indian migration to Australia. So my father came here in the 60s, and I was always of the impression that he and his friends were some of the first people to come from India. I started to read about that kind of migration much later and found that that people had been coming from India since the early 1800s and since the early times of colonization. And even the British sent some of their convicts from India to Australia. So I guess it started off with me discovering this new history, but also on a personal level, with always having this feeling that when I'm in India, I'm the most Australian person that anyone knows. When I'm in Australia, I'm often the most Indian person that anyone knows. So we were talking about normatism before. So kind of tackling that. And then also when I work, I look at any opportunity to kind of nudge the idea of Australian identity away from its Anglo-Celtic roots, which it's held onto so firmly for the last 230 years, despite, of course, there being First Nations people here for more than 40,000 years. So any kind of opportunity that I would get to make a very small contribution to changing that, is something that I'm always very interested in working with. What we're looking at on screen is a money order coming from Australia back to Punjab. And this was obviously just to explain a little bit about the men that came from India, and it was only men. They weren't allowed to bring families, children, anything like that. So generally what happened is men from the Punjab came to Australia with the idea that there may be work here, not necessarily to work as hawkers. And hawkers, what they did was went into the main towns, Melbourne, Sydney, wherever, Adelaide, purchased goods, initially started on foot, then got a horse and wagon if they were successful, and went into small country towns and regional areas and sold to the settler community and also to the Aboriginal communities, those goods that they brought from within the cities. So they became kind of mobile department stores, and it was something that that wasn't a thing. It wasn't something that happened before they came. So there were also people coming from Syria and other countries as well. But at some stage, it's estimated that there was up to 10,000 people from India working in this profession. So my understanding from reading and talking to people is that often agrarian families would almost sacrifice was usually a young male member of the family to go and earn money and repatriate those funds. And within my work, I found families in India that were still living in houses that were built from the funds of people that worked as hawkers here. So this is a item I found in the archive in New South Wales of within a hawker's papers of money that he'd sent back. So I wanted to work with archival material, but then I also, and this image is, rather than starting my exhibition and my book with a kind of artist statement, I begin it with this, and I print this on a very large scale in vinyl, and it's attached to the wall. And this is it's basically a complaint, and it's kind of citing the Indian hawkers as a nuisance, and trying to garner support for licensing them more heavily. And it's a general kind of vilification along racial lines, which is still something that, you know, it's still a kind of politics that's used today in Australia against, you know, various non-Anglo ethnicities. So I kind of set the scene both in the book and in exhibitions by using this rather than a kind of more formal introduction. So the other thing I wanted to do was to find descendants of these hawkers, and that was the purpose of that, was to bring the old archival material into conversation with kind of modern events, or with the kind of modern world, to bring them into conversation, to show that this is a living history, and that I'm not talking about something that's happened that doesn't affect contemporary Australia and post-colonial Australia today. So this is a man who, this was taken in the UK, and many of the descendants I found were actually in the UK, because the UK had much more liberal migration policies in the 50s and 60s. So many of the men, the hawkers, because they couldn't bring their wives, they either died alone in Australia, or they went back as old men to their villages and their families in India once their working lives had finished. So often that generation, it kind of ended, it began and ended with the men who came. So I found many of the descendants had since migrated from the UK, or they were born in the UK like this person. And I spoke to him, and the reason I took the image in this way is he told me, I'm a member of a pigeon shooting club. It struck me, not as an irony, but it was interesting to me and conveyed to his friends just before he died that he wanted to be cremated and his ashes sent back and immersed in the Ganges. That was never passed on to his family in India, but a funeral parlour in Australia held on to his ashes for 63 years. Until this person was told by a researcher that we think your great uncle's ashes are in Australia, and he duly came and took them back to India and immersed them in the Ganges in Haridwar. So that this was a story as well that was so amazing that it also got me interested into the project. And then, some of the, stage photography. So I was interested. I collected items that the hawkers had sold. I met numerous people that had could still remember the hawkers coming to their farms and to their family homes. Obviously very old now, but could remember in the early 20th century hawkers coming in the 30s and 40s. So collected some of the items. And then one thing, this is just outside of Jalandhar, where I'd gone to meet a descendant's family. And one of the things I wanted to put in the book and into the work was the different landscapes. So I include different landscapes, an Indian landscape, a British landscape, an Australian landscape. to kind of highlight that the cultural dislocation that, you know, perhaps a 15, 16-year-old boy would have felt when they came to Australia, you know, from you know, a town in Punjab or wherever. So I wanted to highlight that kind of, you know, beyond the, you know, the treatment they received in Australia or any sort of difficulties, just that in that internal experience that they must have had that, you know, perhaps was very difficult to express. So I included different landscapes. And then the other thing I found was a lot of the hawkers' graves in Australia, and they were most often buried away from the other interns in the cemetery. This grave says Ali Buck, B-U-K, which I assume is a kind of anglicization of Buksh. And then interestingly, obviously, they've written Indian hawker. So that kind of says something about that became this person's identity as well. So I wanted to talk about that, but and this person hawked for a long time in Western Victoria for more than, I think, 20, 25 years. So he was buried off 63 meters away from the nearest grave. So I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that this is Ali Buck here, the person looking at the camera. So I found this we have in Australia, in country towns, we have small historical societies who keep things over time. And so I found this image there in the town where he's buried. Another really interesting thing for me was the official documentation. This is a part of something called a certificate of exemption for dictation test. One of the ways that the Australian government kept people, non-Anglo people out, was that when they came to Australia after 1901, which is when the White Australia policy was brought in, they had something called a dictation test. Now that was given to the person wanting to enter Australia in a language of the customs officer's choice, 50 words. So the idea being that basically, you know, this person has come from India, we don't want them there, we'll ask them to do their dictation test in French. But the exception to this was if you'd already been here before 1901 and you wanted to leave to go back to India for a visit or whatever, you could get an exemption from that test when you came back. So these certificates are readily available within the National Archives here. So I sourced a lot of those that were given to people who worked as hawkers. So that also helped me generally research. Again, there was 2 Sikh men buried here, and they were actually buried. Cremation wasn't allowed. They were buried in this cemetery, in this section called, which, you know, was all the cemeteries were lined up in terms of religious denominations. So Methodist, Protestant, whatever. And then basically it was Indians and Chinese from the gold rush that were buried in this section. So I found two graves in this section. Again, this said so much to me about Australia at that time, and the fact that it was still sitting there in 2020 without any sort of irony, and obviously had been made again and stuff. So that was interesting in a country town in Victoria. I think I also looked at personal kind of documents from the people that had worked as hawkers. So this is from the great grandfather of this person who this is taken in Sydney. I asked him where he'd like to be photographed. He said the mosque. So his great grandfather, Khawaja Bucks, actually hired a scribe to write his memoirs, and this is about coming to Australia and beginning his work as a hawker. But it really describes beautifully, you know, just how they started with nothing, and he became fabulously wealthy within Australia, and actually repatriated money and built a mosque in Lahore, which is still there, called the Australia Mosque. I can keep going. There's lots of fascinating documents and family stories and everything, but hopefully that gives you an idea of, yeah.
Thank you very, very much. I think it sort of very fruitfully brings us into a few questions regarding, and I was just making a few notes, you know, the whole idea of micro archives, as it were. And we
Yeah.
call them micro archives, but actually at the end of the day, they are the stuff of where we've come from and the histories that have just, you know, been elided for very, very long. So somehow they no longer remain in that space of marginality, I feel, but very much, you know, central to how the functioning of the world uh, has led to where we have ended up today. And so they're kind of unique caches of cultural material like this that, you know, I think grandstand in one sense the whole question of place making situations. But it's also, I think, questions of what is edited out of history sometimes and what can be re-edited back into history.
Yeah.
I think that is a very critical question, and it also sort of then therefore brings us to Rajat's project. So I'm going to
Yeah,
ask you, Rajat, to make
yeah.
your presentation question of the photo album.
Basically, when I started the project, so it's pretty difficult for me to point out camera to the family members because from 2013 I am shooting all the events of my families and the gatherings on all things. But we that time we had a big joint family of 17 members, and in 2017 the whole family breakup. So it's like twice this family breakup because in 1964 my grandparents came here in India. So the partition, the thing in Southeast Asia from Bangladesh to India, it like it happens for like 3 times in 1964, in 47 and 71. So in 74 it's like a quite bizarre incident, like from Kashmir, the Prophet Muhammad's here, it's a relic in Islam, so it got theft. So that create the rage over Bangladesh, and like there's an ethnic cleansing of the Hindu part in Bangladesh. So they migrated from Bangladesh to India overnight. So they didn't have any memory of their home last few moments. So it's like when I asked my father to like, is there any memory of, because when I started the project, so I talked with my father, with my grandfather, like how the whole things came here in India. Like they didn't have any clear memories. So in this project, I just tried to fill those memory gaps. It's like a pocket of memories in this project. It's like, so in childhood, we used to cut papers from different part of in magazines, in newspaper, so and put it together in some kind of practice. It's like we have to do that with my uncle. So when I started this work, so the thing helps me that when I found this collage stuff long time back, so that helps me. It's like the family broke up twice. They have came from Bangladesh to here, and now in India they also break down. So the main thing is like to bring these collages, not only photographs, to bring these collages to the project. Like they are from different origin, but in a same place, in a same work. It's like the family members. It's like they are still lived in the same house, but They didn't talk to each other, or like it's separated. When in 1964, my grandparents came here in Calcutta. So my grandparents, they made a 2-story wooden house here. It's it's a two-story wooden house. So there was, all houses are in localities are like, they're in pakka house. It's like brick made house. But it's a it's a unique timestamp of this work. I think I tried to capture in the project. It's like from 90s to 2022 or like something. I still working on this project. So for me, the work is like a timestamp. It's like when someone is going through my work, they will see the changes of time. It's like the work consists of the family album pictures and like present time pictures and that and the all things. So for me, the important thing is like to complete this work. So I have still working on this project. I have tried to make a book out of it, and it's like yesterday I have just got the first copy of my book. So it's it was I was trying to figure out this what kind of form it's going to be, or like how is it going to look. That's all.
Thank you, Rajat. I think what you've brought up actually is very much critical, maybe, to the dimension of where things are today, and how we think about family and how we think about reconnecting and rekindling our relationship over passages of time. And not to make it sound, in some respect, disembodied, but there is a sense in which all that occurs in the family and the memories that are generated, maybe in time, those are memories that also can be reconstructed. And that's what I find fascinating with your work, when you put it across for how things are being brought together at a time when they might seem disintegrated. Everyone who has looked at their own projects, specifically within this issue, has come to that moment of the question of the personal in a social moment, the question of the personal in a political moment, and how to sort of bring that out in projects, because after all, they are not just projects, they are just life stories somewhere. And this is what archives eventually are about. It's they are living in, and they're breathing entities, and how to sort of resurrect through them is a very important vector for all of us. So thank you very much for that sense of your project.
I'll just make a comment on how, when we were thinking about this issue, because the last, I think, 19 publications have been sort of like looking at South Asia from here, and the South Asia that that we defined, but we were essentially like, say, going to countries and sort of putting out open calls, soliciting work. And we always had this, what we found as special features. There were always people from outside these physical locations that identified with South Asia that would submit. And Yask, I think you were one of those. It was, I think that was the time we used to do issues specific to India. And then we had something that came in from an Indian living in, or somebody of Indian origin living in Australia. And that really brings up these questions of identity. And we always found a way to insert these, which were technically not, didn't fit the bounds of that we were only imposing on our own, on the publication and this archive. And so this issue has been interesting because we thought that we would look at South Asians outside these quote unquote boundaries. And that's where I think, Zinnia and Yask, this time you guys were the, I think the contributions that we were soliciting actively, but when we see someone like Rajat, who's talking about a migration that has happened across a border for a political reason, not necessarily like as a part of a larger political moment, and how that really shifted for us, like how we think of the idea of passages, like there are families that have migrated and like migrated out for personal reasons, for economic reasons, but also these political movements that have taken place within these shores. So for us, it was really, it really sort of challenged our own thinking of like, what is a population within and without? What is the diaspora? How do we even define that? Do we want to put more boundaries, or do we want to sort of open that up? And we found it quite fascinating where, you know, all of us are delving into such deeply personal issues of identity, but also speaking about larger ideas of gender, of racism, of a political moment in, you know, in India and Bangladeshi history. So just wanted to thank you guys for your contributions and how it really challenged us to revise our own, like continuously evolve our own understanding also of what this region is and has come to mean. So thank you.
Maybe to use Zinnia just to trigger this this process. When I was looking at the sort of hour of your work, and of course, one of the things that I was thinking about, and maybe this segues into a little bit also of your work, Yask, are narratives that we consider within quote unquote to be counter narratives, whether they are in fact counter and counter to what, especially since we're dealing with questions of families and archives, whether the terminology itself is something that requires revision. I feel sometimes that the words that we end up using to contextualize whether archives are authentic or legitimate, it comes into such a huge question when it's looking at questions of family location that is pieced together through scraps and maybe through, you know, bits of memory that really have to be tied in. It's a bit of it's a contingency in the sense that it's a moment of ambivalence. It's a moment at which you are sort of trying to piece together a part of something that is absent and filling in a gap as a result. I wanted to ask you, Zinnia, because the work that I've seen of yours, at least online and otherwise, seems to maneuver different sort of media terrains. I bring this up again, whether it's looking at video work or, you know, family footage in videos, or sort of reconstructing material generated from different kinds of archives, or in fact, one that I found extremely poignant, the moment at which you return home, as it were, as a documentarian, quote unquote, become moments that are extremely sort of potent and dense, and maybe in some way and form come to filter within the Dear Nani series. Can you talk a little bit about that question of piecing together archives that are sometimes disparate, and sort of making new memories through projects like the Dear Nani one, which you which you've said in various ways is a kind of insertion of yourself within the story, making it your own. And hence my question is speaking a little more to your process over time.
So yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I have a few. I feel like also for me, it does become a little project specific. Like I kind of tackle these things differently each time I approach a new body of work. But no, it's interesting. I think you're referring to my film Sea View, in which I went back to Karachi and I incorporate family, also video footage with my own footage. And I think even more than piecing together, sometimes it's me also making my own relationships with the work and making my own narrative and making my own story. So I guess because, yeah, like I'm pulling things together, but then also trying to kind of frame my narratives in a specific way. So one thing I used to say, I think too, like early in my practice, I used to talk a bit about like cultural translation, because I am here working in Canada and most of my audience is a Western audience. I felt like I'm constantly needing to like translate what I'm experiencing. So in that film Sea View, like I went back to Karachi and had my first time basically trying to be a photographer in that place where I didn't feel like I fit in per se. And I felt like I had to translate that experience because I was actually making that when I was in art school here in Toronto. But with Dear Nani, it was an additional challenge because you have, these images and there's many different ways you can read them. there could have been a directly queer reading as well on the work and, talking about that aspect. But I wanted to also, it was really important for me that the colonial aspect of the reading of the work was not lost, because we have this kind of what often the Western understanding of oh, a Pakistani woman in the 40s, how could she be dressing up? How could she be in a suit? How could she be, just being happy or being free, totally contraring what people expect. And I had so many questions like that when I first showed the work, oh, how was that okay? People are just so used to, definitely brainwashed by the media and not understanding 1948 was a very different time, and we don't always, conservatism doesn't always go forward, or sometimes it goes forward and backwards. There's different sort of cultural tropes from different times that were acceptable, that were normal at the time. And so that was another reason that I decided to include the text component in the work, because I did feel like I needed to give a little bit of context, especially to a Western audience. But I also, one of the reasons I left the text opaque, because I also kind of had a grudge. I was kind of I'm going to leave some of this private, because some of this is also my personal family history, and you don't have to know everything. Some things can be mysterious, but I'll give you the facts, so you're not there's some way to kind of lead you in, and then you can kind of start to make interpretations for yourself as well. So it's often a push and pull for me in the work.
Yeah, I mean, what stands out for me then are a few other questions, and maybe that leads on to a question for you, Yask, and that is the whole question of subjectivities and the kind of polarization that can also emanate from unearthing some of these histories, right? And I find the whole question of subcontinental nationhood is tackled by you in a very visceral kind of way, because though you are talking about the treatment of a particular class outside India, these are sort of disparities that also remain constant and perennial within India. And there are many ways in which it's been politicized in the last many, many years. So I'm thinking of a kind of critical acknowledgement that you have done through your work. And I say it's critical because it's a kind of inside out and outside in view, as it were, looking at the state of the treatment of certain communities, migrant communities, over a period of time. So using that as a lens, can you talk a little bit about, the politics of your project and how you came about it, how you came about looking at this particular history?
I think for me, using the archive and constructing stories through the archive, and obviously they're subjective stories, but in a sense, you're given a great responsibility. You're given that cultural capital to express your point of view. And I think in that sense, it's very important for me to understand the socio-political relationships and landscapes that you're dealing with, and to have those, the visuals are actually very secondary to understanding those relationships. So for me, that's, in when I'm working with the archive, that's very important for me. Then one thing with my particular work that I wanted to, that was very important for me, was to not present the people that came from undivided India as part of the colonial project, and in a sense just annex them into the idea of being pioneers. So I wanted very much to look at what was happening at the time, and to present the people that came to Australia as them responding to colonization within their own space, within their own country, and in a sense being forced to migrate to recapture some of the wealth that had been taken from them. And that was, in a sense, the motivation from their journey. So it was very important for me to steer clear of presenting them as, as just another early Australian, and just broadening basically the same narrative, but annexing, people essentially with brown skin. So that was the key for me to avoid that. Yeah.
There's a moment at which I was also thinking about how certain kinds of imagery perform for one another. And I think that element of a reenactment of time certainly exists in some of the work, even yours. There's certainly that element. But I mean this within your series, as in for me, there was that moment at which you have that placard which on which strangers is written. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. What provoked that image? How did it come about?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there was two Sikh men in that part of the cemetery, and that part of the cemetery was extremely bare. It was basically people that had come from China and were part of the gold mining era. And then there were these two Indian men who'd been buried, and they were Sikhs, and they'd been buried because cremations weren't allowed. And I actually found out that in the next couple of years, other Sikhs, their friends, had actually exhumed them and cremated them, but their headstones remain. And then I think, as I mentioned in the presentation, the fact that sign was still there, that was seen as still something that was legitimate, like that sign had been remade. It wasn't the original stranger's sign, so to speak, that had been there 100 and, whatever years ago, when I think it was 100, they both of them perished in the 1920s. Yeah, so I mean, the fact that that's still there, and then a lot of the same cultural dynamics are existing within Australia. So that image was also taken to hint at that as well, that this is not something that's just in the past, and this is not something, but that Australia is still has that very dominant Anglo-Celtic identity at its core. And so, yeah, that's what led to that image. Yeah.
It sort of makes me want to ask this question, and we can begin also asking this question, and it can go around, is sort of the thinking around, in very broad terms, the decolonial project that has come to bear in institutions, outside institutions, academically, para-academically, and so on. This has been a move, within and outside the university, certainly starting from the university in some respect, but moving outside to public domain. And I was thinking about that in a more conversational way, of course, when Rajat, you were speaking. Because what is that decolonial project but something that has affect and time, as two very essential means through which you can rewrite or reinscribe yourself or rethink the moment that we are currently in. I wanted to know from all of you, maybe beginning with Rajat, how this is moderated, how this is mediated. And of course, Rajat, you use a very strong sort of typology and the methodology of collage, bringing things together and a sort of melding of them. But they are also done, I would say, not just quite simply, but there's the idea of the photo album as something in which you want to see these become real photo albums, these montages to be somewhere real in the world and not to be seen simply as, impositions and superimpositions of, is what I thought was poignant and sentient within the work. So maybe you can speak to that, and then Zinnia and Yask, you can speak to this idea of, the grand project within which some things might get inscribed, but maybe there's something to be said about them. Yeah, as well. Sorry, Rajat.
For me, it's like memories get faded with time. So I didn't see those realities. It's like, for me, those events are like photographs, right?
Mhm.
So like recent times, what happens in Ukraine, we are seeing it in like online, internet, Instagram reels, but we can't experience those things. We are writing, we're sharing, but we can't experience those. It's like, for me, like this kind of projects, or the project I am working with, is like to filling those memory gaps. It's like what they are experiencing, to listening to them, to put it all together in our work. It's like to represent a whole time to someone to see what the whole things look like, what the whole era, what the whole like, if it's like a time strip, it's like a film strip, it's like the whole strip look. For me, it's like to represent the strip, the time strip. It's like how it's look like to the other person who didn't experience those things, or like for me, it's
So this idea of the synoptic view, right, the grand narrative, and how one is being episodic from time to time in one's practice and telling that narrative is something that I thought within the sort of so-called rubric of what we consider, the decolonizing project to be something maybe Zinnia and Yes you could speak to, and then yeah, I think we're meant to open it up to discussion. But Tanvi, do you want to add something to that before they
Yeah.
respond?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about what you said about Rajat's work and this idea of the family album and the constructed family album. And I think for Zinnia and Yask, who haven't seen the work yet, and you'll see it when you get a copy, it's very interesting because there's collaging of old images, which is sort of like it's a cut and paste job within the work itself. So it's like Rajat's own photographs along with these collages. And it really rang a bell when the idea of the family album, because how much do photographs like we all talk about like how much photographs lie, what is the truth, etc. But the family album is always this like remnant of somehow of happiness. It's all the good memories are like packed into these like folds of these pages, and so much is left out. The conflict is out, and the tensions are never really in the family album. So in Rajat, your work, that was something that really sort of stood out to me, because these collages sort of bring in those aspects of looking at like the holistic view of the family in a way, and the reality of the relationships. And I found that actually quite fascinating that he opens the work with the cover of the family album. So this idea of good memories, and what do we hold back and what do we construct as we want to remember. And also something else in your work, Rajat, that I thought about a lot while editing it was, when we look at images of the partition, the 71 partition, there's the photojournalism, and then there's the Mukti Bahini, and incidentally we had a work in our previous issue, which was actually somebody who was on the front lines, a soldier from the Indian army, who actually was recording what the behind the scenes of the war looks like. So he called it a boring war, and all these a band of brothers, how are they within the army, like in their off times. And yours sort of provides this additional history, because we always look at images of migration and we talk about that process of movement, but what does that do to people's lives after? You think you've moved for a better life, and in many aspects you do, but in your work, what I like is the tension remains and the conflict remains. And so I really appreciated what you tried to do with it, and how it also sort of subverts the usual idea of the family album that we're all very used to and like to present to the world. So
for me, it's like a parallel reality. It's like what happening parallelly with those partition things, or like what happened to those families who came to India, or like to move somewhere else. Like not documentary kind of things, like the war documentary or something that shows, but like what they experience. For me,
yeah, and that the story doesn't end just after the
exactly,
migration,
it's
like
it's like short stories. It's like it's never ends. It's like there's
yeah,
something untold at the last page, like that.
which is exactly what Yask, your work also does, right? That it's a lived history, and that it's a living history, and it's something that's ongoing, and it reflects so much of your own. In many ways, I'm sure it has come from personal experience that sort of connects. Your family might not be in there, but it's there in so many ways. So yeah, perhaps you could take off from there and give a response to Rahab's question.
Yeah, I think part of that whole idea of the decolonizing process is, if I talk about photography in Australia, it's almost like to put it simply it's great because you're now given this extra space, but you're almost allocated, okay, you're the Indian photographer, you're one of the representatives of that space. And for me, that's good, but it can also end up being very surface in that sense. So but I look at it as a way to examine the political economy within this country, and in future work, hopefully the political economy of India as well. So it's very important the way you use it. As far as talking about this work as being kind of autobiographical, definitely, and part of the broader exhibition was some video pieces I made, which basically talk about how I am connected, to those ideas of Indian and those experiences of Indian migration, one, and then two, living cross-culturally myself, and the kind of ways that changes you as a person, or that forms you as a person. So yeah, I think it's a responsibility, and you have to use it very wisely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because this whole, responsibility is one thing, and there's all this conversation that's going on now, as much as there's like a wrestling back of power of the narrative, that stories about us, but they haven't been told, they've been told without us. So how much do we want to change that narrative? But there's also this parallel debate, right? Like, where you don't want to be stuck in the idea of provenance. Like, not always trying to prove the authentic narrative just by source of origin. And you have Pakistani roots, so that's the story that you'll tell the best, and that's the only story you're capable of telling, or somebody from some other part of the world. And Zinnia, perhaps you can tell us if you've had if those questions have also come up for you, and living in a place far away from the subcontinent, is that how you're seen as an artist, and how do you sort of wrestle with that idea?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Tanvi. No, I think it's definitely something that it's a constant struggle. But I think, like, as we've touched on, and I think, both Rajat and Yetsa's projects also seem to be working with, is kind of just complexifying the narrative and like showing, I think what I find is the best way to tackle that is to just not try to make everything like in a cookie cutter, or in a like the way that, especially the way that people expect maybe a South Asian artist to work, or especially like I really love, I think it actually gives me that's when it gives me like a feeling of agency, when I can like push back against the expectations, and sometimes talk about more complicated or more messy or more difficult experiences. Like some of my other work addresses more directly ideas of like Canadian nationalism, and like the kind of ideas of what a proper Canadian citizen is supposed to look like, and how my family relates to that, and or more difficult experiences by migrants. So I'm trying to push that in different parts of my practice, and I think it's just important for us. Like, I mean, I think decolonizing is such a huge word, and I don't know if we're really ever going to be fully decolonized. I don't really think that's ever going to happen. I think it's really just about not being afraid of, just telling all the sides of the stories, like the good and the bad and the difficult, just showing it all. Yeah.
So
thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I hope to meet you guys in person sometime, somewhere in the world. Rajat, we might meet you sooner, considering you're right here in another city. But
surely.
see you guys soon.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.